Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his sleek leather chair, the city skyline shimmering through the floor to ceiling windows of his office. To anyone else, he had it all: a thriving business, a penthouse apartment that spoke of success, and the kind of reputation that turned heads in any room he entered. But beneath the polished exterior, Ethan felt an unsettling emptiness creeping in. Meetings, deals, and relentless ambition had consumed his life, leaving little room for anything personal or meaningful. Lately, that void felt larger than ever. The pressure to maintain his image as a successful, grounded man was relentless. His clients, particularly the influential ones, seemed obsessed with the idea of family values and authenticity, traits that didn't come naturally to Ethan. He hadn't spoken to his parents in years, hadn't dated anyone serious in longer, and the few friends he had were more like business allies than confidants. It was a lonely existence, but one he had grown accustomed to until the upcoming dinner with Mr. Donovan threatened to upend everything. Mr. Donovan was a legend in the world of high-stakes investments, a man whose approval could propel Ethan's company into the stratosphere. But Donovan had a reputation for valuing personal connections as much as financial ones. He wanted to know the people he worked with, their families, their lives. And somewhere along the line, Ethan had mentioned having a wifeiest slip of the tongue born out of desperation to seem relatable. Now, Donovan had insisted on meeting her at the dinner, and Ethan found himself scrambling to fix the lie. Ethan's gaze drifted to the framed photo on his desk. It was an old picture of his family from years ago, taken at a time when things were simpler. His mother's warm smile, his father's hand resting on his shoulder, it all felt like another lifetime. He hadn't spoken to them since his father had disapproved of his decision to leave the family business, to build his own empire. The bitterness from those conversations still lingered, and Ethan had buried himself in work to avoid confronting it. As the weight of his situation pressed down on him, a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Clara entered with her usual quiet grace, balancing a tray with his coffee and a small stack of mail. She was dressed in her modest uniform, her auburn hair pulled back into a neat bun, and her expression was as composed as ever. Clara had been working for him for nearly 5 years, her presence a constant in his otherwise chaotic life. She was efficient, dependable, and kind qualities Ethan rarely took the time to acknowledge, though he silently appreciated them. Clara set the tray down on the desk, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "Your coffee, sir," she said, her voice soft but steady. She glanced at him briefly, her green eyes catching a hint of concern. "You look tired. Long day." Ethan managed a tight smile. "You could say that. Just a lot on my plate." Clara nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't pry. She never did. It was one of the reasons Ethan valued her. She knew when to step back, when to let the silence fill the space. But today, that silence felt heavier than usual. As she turned to leave, Ethan's words stopped her mid-step. "Clara, wait." She turned back, her eyebrows raised in mild curiosity. "I need help," he admitted, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "It's about this dinner I have coming up." Clara tilted her head, intrigued but cautious. "What kind of help?" Ethan hesitated, feeling absurd even voicing the thought that had been circling his mind all afternoon. "I need someone to pretend to be my wife, just for one evening." For a moment, Clara simply stared at him, as if trying to gauge whether he was serious. Then she let out a small laugh, thinking it must be a joke. But when Ethan's expression remained serious, her amusement faded. "You're not joking." "No, I'm not," Ethan said, leaning forward slightly. "It's complicated. There's this investor, and he has this thing about family values. I may have mentioned I was married, and now he's expecting to meet my wife at dinner. If he finds out I lied," Clara held up a hand, stopping him. "Wait, you want me to pretend to be your wife? Me? Ethan, I clean your house. I'm your maid. And you're also smart, capable, and someone I can trust," Ethan countered. "Look, I know it's a ridiculous request, but I wouldn't ask if I had any other options. I need someone who can handle themselves in a room full of high-profile people. I need you. Clara frowned, her arms crossed as she considered his words. She had always been pragmatic, not one to make impulsive decisions. This doesn't make any sense, she said finally. Why me? Why not hire an actress or, I don't know, someone who's more suited for this? Because I don't trust an actress to keep this discreet, Ethan admitted. This isn't just about pretending for one night. It's about protecting my reputation, my business. And you're the only person I trust with that. Clara exhaled slowly, her expression softening. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the vulnerability he rarely showed. For all his wealth and power, Ethan looked like a man on the verge of losing something important. She didn't know why she felt a pang of sympathy for him, but she did. This is a lot to ask, she said quietly. I know, Ethan replied, and I'll make it worth your while. I'll double your salary for the month, triple it if you want. Clara shook her head. It's not about the money. Then why hesitate? Because this could go wrong in so many ways, she said honestly. But if you're really that desperate, I'll think about it. Ethan felt a flicker of relief. Thank you, Clara. That's all I'm asking. As Clara left the room, her mind raced with thoughts about what she'd just agreed to consider. The idea of pretending to be someone she wasn't felt surreal, almost laughable. But there was something about the way Ethan had looked at her earnest, almost vulnerable, that made her pause. For all his flaws, she could tell he wasn't used to asking for help. And that, more than anything, made her reconsider. By the time she returned to her small quarters in the servants' wing, Clara was still wrestling with the decision. She glanced at the worn locket she always wore around her neck, her fingers brushing over its surface. Inside was a picture of her parents, a reminder of the life she had left behind and the sacrifices she had made to survive. Whatever Ethan was asking of her, it couldn't be more daunting than the challenges she'd already faced. As the night stretched on, both Ethan and Clara found themselves lying awake, their thoughts tangled in the uncertainties of what lay ahead. For Ethan, it was the fear of failure, of losing everything he had worked so hard to build. For Clara, it was the question of whether stepping into Ethan's world, even for one night, would change the way she saw herself and him forever. Ethan's office was unusually quiet the following morning, the kind of stillness that seemed to underline the absurdity of the situation he had created. He sat at his desk, his fingers drumming on the polished wood as he stared at his phone. Clara hadn't given him an answer yet, and the suspense was gnawing at him. Ethan was a man accustomed to control, to having things run on his schedule. Waiting wasn't something he was good at. The soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. Clara entered, her expression composed as always, though Ethan thought he detected a faint unease in her eyes. She had obviously been thinking about his request as much as he had. Ethan stood, gesturing for her to take a seat, but she remained by the door, her hands folded in front of her. I've decided, she said, her voice steady but measured. I'll help you. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, though it was tinged with guilt. He knew he was asking a lot of her, more than any employer should. Thank you, he said earnestly. I know this isn't easy for you. No, it's not, Clara replied, her tone firm but not unkind. But I understand why you're asking. Just let's keep this professional. No surprises, no last-minute changes. Ethan nodded. Absolutely. Professional. There was an awkward pause, one that seemed to underline the fact that nothing about this situation was remotely professional. Clara cleared her throat. So, what exactly do you need me to do? Ethan moved to the small seating area in his office, motioning for Clara to join him. She hesitated before sitting on the edge of the sofa, her posture stiff. Ethan pulled out a folder from the coffee table, filled with notes and details about the dinner. It's a private event, just a handful of people, he explained. Mr. Donovan and his wife, a couple of other investors. They'll be expecting us to come as a couple, which means we need to look the part. Clara raised an eyebrow. Look the part? You mean, I need to pretend I'm used to dining with millionaires? Something like that, Ethan admitted. You're smart, Clara. You can handle the conversations. It's the presentation we need to work on. Presentation, she echoed, her tone skeptical. You mean I need to look like I belong in your world? Ethan winced. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant, Clara said, though there was no malice in her voice. And you're not wrong. If I'm going to pull this off, I can't go in looking like, well, myself. Ethan hesitated before nodding. I've already arranged for a stylist to help. Someone discreet. Of course you have, Clara muttered, though there was a faint hint of amusement in her tone. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. True to his word, Ethan had brought in a stylist, a woman named Vivian, who arrived with an air of authority and a wardrobe that could have outfitted royalty. Clara felt like a fish out of water as Vivian appraised her with a critical eye, muttering about silhouettes and color palettes. It was both mortifying and fascinating, being transformed piece by piece into someone she hardly recognized. By the time Vivian was done, Clara stood before the full-length mirror in Ethan's penthouse, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The tailored dress hugged her figure perfectly, the soft emerald fabric bringing out the green in her eyes. Her hair, usually pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, cascaded in soft waves over her shoulders. Even her makeup, subtle but expertly done, felt like a mask she wasn't entirely sure how to wear. See? Perfection, Vivian declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. You'll turn heads, darling. Clara's cheeks flushed. She wasn't used to compliments, especially not ones delivered with such conviction. She glanced at Ethan, who had been watching from the other side of the room. For a moment, his usual composed expression faltered, replaced by something she couldn't quite place: surprise, perhaps, or admiration. You look amazing, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Clara shifted uncomfortably. This feels ridiculous, she said, smoothing the fabric of the dress. I'm a maid, Ethan. This isn't me. It's just for one night, Ethan reminded her. And you're not just a maid, Clara. You're... He trailed off, as if realizing he was about to say too much. You'll do great. Despite Ethan's reassurance, Clara couldn't shake her discomfort. The transformation was superficial, and she knew it. No matter how polished she looked, she was still the same person underneath a woman who had spent her life working hard for every scrap of dignity and stability she had. Pretending to be someone else, even for a night, felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. Their rehearsals began shortly after. Ethan had mapped out their story meticulously, detailing how they had met, how long they had been married, even small anecdotes about their supposed life together. Clara found it both amusing and exhausting, trying to memorize the lies while maintaining the facade of a loving wife. Why did you say we met at a bookstore? Clara asked during one of their practice sessions. Ethan shrugged. It seemed normal. Normal, Clara repeated, raising an eyebrow. Do you even go to bookstores? I do, actually, Ethan said defensively. Occasionally, Clara couldn't help but laugh, a sound that caught Ethan off guard. It was rare to hear her laugh, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. Ethan found himself smiling despite the absurdity of the situation. As the dinner drew closer, the rehearsals became less about the details and more about the dynamics. Ethan and Clara had to learn how to act like a couple, how to share looks of affection, how to navigate conversations as a team. It was awkward at first, with both of them tripping over their words and avoiding eye contact. But slowly, they began to find a rhythm, an unspoken understanding that made the charade almost believable. Almost. On the night of the dinner, Ethan waited in the living room, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He was nervous, though he would never admit it. The stakes were high, and failure wasn't an option. When Clara stepped out of her room, he turned Dan for a moment. He forgot how to speak. She was stunning. The dress Vivian had chosen for her, a deep green gown, with an elegant neckline, fit her perfectly. Her hair and makeup, done with the same meticulous care, made her look every bit the part of a wealthy socialite. But it wasn't just her appearance that struck him. It was the way she carried herself, with a quiet confidence that Ethan hadn't seen before. "You look," Ethan began, but the words felt inadequate. "Incredible." Clara gave him a small smile, though her nerves were evident in the way she fidgeted with the hem of her dress. "Let's just get this over with," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety she felt. Ethan offered her his arm, a gesture that felt both foreign and intimate. "Ready?" "Not even a little," Clara admitted, but she took his arm anyway. As they stepped into the waiting car, both of them couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. For Ethan, it was the pressure to succeed, to maintain the image he had so carefully crafted. For Clara, it was a fear of being exposed, of stepping into a world where she didn't belong. Yet, as the car pulled away, a quiet understanding passed between Thima's shared determination to see this through, no matter what the night would bring. The car ride to the dinner venue was steeped in a tense silence. Ethan sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the passing city lights. Clara, seated beside him, smoothed her dress for the 100th time, trying to steady the butterflies that had taken up residence in her stomach. She had never been to a dinner like this before, surrounded by millionaires and power brokers, and the idea of stepping into their world, even temporarily, was both intimidating and surreal. "You're going to do great," Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. Clara glanced at him, surprised by the unexpected reassurance. "Thanks," she said softly, her fingers playing with the clasp of her purse. "I just hope I don't embarrass you." "You won't," he said firmly. "You're better at handling people than half the executives I've worked with." Clara smiled faintly, though her doubts lingered. She had spent the past few days rehearsing their story, memorizing the details Ethan had painstakingly outlined, but none of it had prepared her for how she might feel when the moment actually arrived. She wasn't just stepping into a role, she was stepping into a completely different world, one where every glance, every word would be scrutinized. When the car pulled up to the Grand Hotel, Clara's breath caught in her throat. The building was opulent, its facade glowing in the warm light of the evening. Uniformed attendants opened the doors, ushering them inside with polished efficiency. Clara gripped Ethan's arm a little tighter as they walked through the towering marble foyer, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Just stay close to me," Ethan murmured, sensing her unease. "And remember, confidence is key." The private dining room was even more extravagant than Clara had imagined. A massive crystal chandelier hung overhead, casting a warm glow over the elegantly set table. Fine china and gleaming silverware adorned the surface, while waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved silently about the room, ensuring everything was perfect. A small group of impeccably dressed guests was already mingling near the bar, their laughter and conversation blending into the soft hum of the background music. Ethan led Clara toward the group, his posture straight and his expression carefully composed. As they approached, a tall man with salt and pepper hair turned, his eyes lighting up as he spotted Ethan. "Ethan Caldwell," the man said warmly, extending a hand. "I was beginning to think you'd change your mind." "Not a chance, Mr. Donovan," Ethan replied, shaking the man's hand firmly. "And please call me Ethan." Donovan's gaze shifted to Clara, his smile widening. "And this must be your lovely wife." Clara forced herself to smile, though her heart was racing. "Clara Caldwell," she said, offering her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure is all mine," Donovan said, his tone genuinely warm. "Ethan, you didn't tell me your wife was so charming." Ethan smiled tightly, his hand resting lightly on Clara's back. "I guess I like to keep some things to myself." As the introductions continued, Clara felt the weight of the guests' eyes on her. They were polite, even gracious, but there was an unspoken scrutiny in their gazes, as though they were trying to place her, to figure out who she really was. Clara responded as smoothly as she could, drawing on the rehearsed anecdotes Ethan had provided. She spoke of their first meeting at a bookstore, their shared love of travel, and the little moments that supposedly made up their life together. To her surprise, the guests seemed genuinely charmed by her. They laughed at her stories, complimented her grace, and seemed to accept her without question. Even Mr. Donovan's wife, a glamorous woman with a sharp wit, took an immediate liking to Clara, pulling her into conversation about art and literature. Ethan watched from a distance, a mixture of relief and admiration flickering in his eyes. Clara was handling herself better than he could have hoped, her natural warmth and intelligence shining through. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar pride, perhaps, or even gratitude. He had underestimated her, and he was beginning to realize just how much she brought to the table. But not everything was as seamless as it seemed. As the evening progressed, Clara found herself struggling to keep up with the subtle nuances of the conversations. The guests spoke of lavish vacations, exclusive events, and business ventures that were completely foreign to her. She nodded and smiled where appropriate, but the effort of maintaining the facade was beginning to wear on her. During a brief lull in the conversation, Clara excused herself and made her way to the restroom, needing a moment to collect herself. She stood at the sink, gripping the edge of the marble counter as she stared at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked confident, polished, even glamorous, but inside, she felt like an imposter. "What am I doing here?" she muttered under her breath. "Excuse me?" Clara turned sharply, startled by the voice. A woman had entered the restroom, her elegant dress and diamond earrings marking her as one of the guests. She smiled apologetically. "I didn't mean to startle you." "It's fine," Clara said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just talking to myself." The woman chuckled. "I do that all the time. I'm Penelope, by the way. Penelope Donovan." Clara blinked. "Oh, you're Mr. Donovan's wife." "That's right," Penelope said, studying Clara with a curious smile. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you're quite the breath of fresh air tonight. So many of these events feel stale, you know? But there's something genuine about you." Clara's cheeks flushed. "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's the truth," Penelope said. "And I don't mean to pry, but you seem a little out of place here. Is everything all right?" Clara hesitated, caught off guard by the question. For a moment, she considered brushing it off, but something in Penelope's express-iona mixture of curiosity and kindness made her pause. "I suppose I am a little out of place," Clara admitted, her voice quiet. Penelope smiled knowingly. "We all feel that way sometimes. But let me give you a little advice. Most of these people are just as insecure as you are. They just hide it better." Clara couldn't help but laugh at that. "I'll try to remember that." When Clara returned to the table, she felt a renewed sense of calm. Penelope's words had grounded her, reminding her that she wasn't the only one wearing a mask. As she resumed her place beside Ethan, she caught his gaze and offered him a reassuring smile. Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the shift in her demeanor, but said nothing. The evening continued, and Clara found herself settling into the role with more ease. She listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and even managed to make a few jokes that drew genuine laughter from the group. Ethan, for his part, was a steady presence by her side, subtly guiding her when necessary, but mostly letting her shine. By the time dessert was served, Clara felt a tentative sense of triumph. She had survived the evening, and more than that, she had managed to impress the people who mattered most to Ethan's business. But just as she was beginning to relax, a comment from one of the guests sent a chill down her spine. "You know, Clara," one of the men said, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" Clara's breath caught. For a moment, she was certain her carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. But before she could respond, Ethan stepped in smoothly, redirecting the conversation with practiced ease. Clara shot him a grateful look, but the moment left her shaken. As the dinner came to an end, Ethan and Clara made their way back to the car, both of them relieved but exhausted. Clara leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes as she let out a long sigh. "You were incredible," Ethan said after a moment. Clara opened her eyes, glancing at him skeptically. "I almost blew it." "But you didn't," Ethan said firmly. "You were exactly what I needed tonight." "Thank you." Clara studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You're welcome, Ethan. I'm just glad I could help." As the car pulled away from the hotel, neither of them spoke, the weight of the evening settling over them. But despite the challenges, there was an unspoken sense of accomplishment between them, a fragile but growing bond that neither of them fully understood yet. The ride back to Ethan's penthouse was quiet, both of them caught in their thoughts. Clara stared out the window at the city lights, trying to process the evening. She had managed to pull off her role, charming the investors, and even holding her own in conversations she never imagined being part of. But the comment from one of the guests, the way he'd said she looked familiar, it lingered in her mind like an itch she couldn't scratch. Ethan, sitting beside her, was equally reflective. He had watched Clara tonight with a mixture of relief and awe. She had exceeded his expectations in every way, seamlessly stepping into a world that wasn't hers and making it seem like she belonged. But there was something else nagging at him, something he couldn't quite define. The way she carried herself, the way she had responded to the evening's challenge made him wonder how little he really knew about her. When they arrived at the penthouse, Ethan escorted Clara to the door, his hand resting lightly on her back in a gesture that felt both protective and oddly natural. "You should get some rest," he said as they stepped inside. "You've earned it." Clara nodded, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. "I think I'll do just that." As she headed to her quarters, Ethan lingered in the living room, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. He replayed the evening in his mind, feeling a rare sense of accomplishment. But even as he celebrated the success of the dinner, there was a nagging feeling he couldn't shake, a sense that tonight had been about more than just saving his reputation. The next morning, Clara woke early, unable to sleep past the swirl of thoughts in her mind. She decided to get a head start on her duties, hoping the routine would help clear her head. As she dusted the bookshelves in Ethan's study, her gaze fell on a small collection of family photos. Most were of Ethan as a child, his parents standing stiffly beside him in formal poses. But one photo caught her attention, a group shot of Ethan's family at what looked like a garden party. Clara's breath hitched as she looked closer. In the background of the photo, partially obscured by a tree, was a face she recognized all too well. Her mother. Her hands trembled as she carefully picked up the frame, staring at the image. It was unmistakable, her mother, wearing the same floral dress Clara had seen in countless old photos, standing among the guests as if she belonged there. But why? What connection could her mother possibly have to Ethan's family? Her heart pounded as questions flooded her mind. She set the photo back on the shelf, careful not to disturb its placement, and quickly left the study. She needed answers, but she wasn't sure where to start or whether she even wanted to know the truth. Later that day, Ethan found Clara in the kitchen, cleaning the countertops with more vigor than usual. He hesitated in the doorway, unsure how to approach her. She seemed distracted, her movements sharp and purposeful, as if trying to channel her thoughts into the task at hand. "Clara," he said softly, stepping into the room. She glanced up, startled, and quickly composed herself. "Good morning," she said, her tone brisk. "Did you need something?" Ethan frowned. "I wanted to check on you. You seemed off last night after the dinner." Clara forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just tired, that's all." He studied her for a moment, his intuition telling him there was more to it. "You did an amazing job," he said. "I don't think I've thanked you properly." "You don't have to thank me," Clara said, turning back to the counter. "I was just doing what you asked." Ethan's brow furrowed. There was something in her tone, something guarded, that gave him pause. "Clara," he said gently, "if there's something bothering you, you can tell me." She hesitated, her grip tightening on the rag she held. For a moment, she considered brushing him off, but the weight of her discovery was too heavy to carry alone. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I saw a photo in your study," she said, her voice carefully measured. "A photo of your family." Ethan blinked, unsure where this was going. "Okay, there was someone in the background," Clara continued, her gaze steady. "A woman. She looked like my mother." Ethan's expression shifted, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Your mother? Are you sure?" Clara nodded. "Positive. I know it sounds strange, but I'm certain it was her." Ethan leaned against the counter, processing her words. "Do you think there's a connection between our families?" "I don't know," Clara admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. "But it doesn't make sense. My mother never mentioned anything about knowing your family." Ethan frowned, his mind racing. "What was your mother's name?" "Margaret," Clara said quietly. "Margaret Lane." The name didn't ring a bell, but something about the situation felt oddly familiar. Ethan straightened, his gaze meeting Clara's. "I think we need to find out the truth." The investigation began cautiously. Ethan retrieved the photo from his study, and together they examined it closely. Clara pointed out her mother in the background, her finger trembling slightly as she traced the outline of the figure. Ethan had to admit, the resemblance was striking. "I can reach out to my parents," Ethan said reluctantly. "They might remember her." Clara hesitated. "Are you sure that's a good idea? You said you're not exactly on good terms with them." "I'll handle it," Ethan said firmly. "This is too important to ignore." It took some effort, but Ethan managed to arrange a meeting with his mother, Eleanor, at a quiet cafe in the city. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, her demeanor as poised and elegant as ever. She greeted Ethan with a cool nod, her sharp eyes flicking over him with thinly veiled disapproval. "You said this was urgent," she said, settling into her seat. "It is," Ethan replied, wasting no time. He pulled out the photo and placed it on the table. "Do you recognize her?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she examined the photo. Her expression remained neutral, but there was a subtle tension in her posture that Ethan didn't miss. "Why are you asking about her?" Eleanor said finally, her tone cautious. "Because she's Clara's mother," Ethan said, leaning forward. "Clara Maid. She recognized her in this photo. She says her name was Margaret Lane." Eleanor's composure slipped for a fraction of a second, her eyes widening in surprise. She quickly recovered, but Ethan had seen enough to know she was hiding something. "I don't see why this is relevant," Eleanor said, her voice clipped. "Margaret worked for us years ago, but that's all." "Worked for you?" Ethan repeated, his brow furrowing. "As what?" "As a housekeeper," Eleanor said. "She was with us for a short time, but she left under difficult circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Ethan pressed. Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flickering to the photo again. "I don't think it's my place to say." "Mother," Ethan said firmly, "if you know something, you need to tell me. Clara deserves to know the truth." Eleanor sighed, her polished exterior cracking just slightly. "Margaret was involved with someone in the family. It caused a scandal, and she chose to leave before things escalated further." "Involved with someone?" Ethan repeated, his stomach tightening. "Who?" Eleanor looked away, her expression hardening. "Your father." The revelation hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He stared at his mother, struggling to process her words. "You're telling me that Clara's mother had an affair with Dad?" "I'm telling you that there's more to this story than you realize," Eleanor said, her tone sharp. "And if you want the full truth, you'll need to ask your father." The confrontation with Ethan's father was even more fraught. When Ethan finally managed to get him on the phone, his father's initial response was dismissive. But when Ethan mentioned Margaret Lane, the silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "How do you know that name?" his father finally asked, his voice low. "She's Clara's mother," Ethan said. "Clara, the woman who works for me. She saw a photo of her mother at one of our family gatherings." "What happened, Dad?" There was a long pause before his father spoke. "Margaret and we were close. closer than we should have been. When she became pregnant, your mother found out, and it complicated things. Ethan's breath caught. Pregnant? Are you saying Clara could be? Yes, his father said quietly. It's possible. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Ethan processed the revelation. If what his father was saying was true, then Clara wasn't just as Maid she might be his half-sister. The implications were staggering, and the weight of the truth threatened to crush him. When Ethan returned to the penthouse that evening, Clara was waiting for him, her expression tense. He had promised to tell her everything, but as he stood before her, the words felt impossible to say. "Clara," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "I found out the truth. About your mother. About us." Clara's eyes widened, fear and anticipation mingling in her gaze. "What is it, Ethan? What did you find out?" Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "Clara, there's a chance you might be my sister." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation hanging between them like a storm cloud. Clara stared at him, her face a mixture of shock, confusion, and disbelief. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know it's a lot to take in," Ethan said quickly. "But if it's true, we need to know for sure." Clara took a step back, her hands trembling as she tried to process what he was saying. "Ethan, this changes everything." "I know," he said softly. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." The night stretched on as they grappled with the truth, their worlds forever altered by a past they couldn't change and a future they could no longer predict. The revelation hung over the penthouse like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. Both Ethan and Clara struggled to process the implications of what they had discovered. The once clear boundaries of their lives had been shattered, leaving them adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Clara retreated to her quarters, her mind racing. She couldn't stop replaying Ethan's words. "You might be my sister." The idea was staggering, a possibility that upended everything she thought she knew about her life. She had always carried the mystery of her mother's past with her, wondering why Margaret Lane had been so guarded about certain parts of her life. Now, the pieces were falling into place, and the picture they created was almost too much to bear. Ethan, too, was grappling with the news. He sat in his study, staring at the photo that had started it all. His father's admission played over and over in his mind. If Clara truly was a sister, what did that mean for their relationship, for the way he had treated her? And how could he make amends for the lies and secrets that had kept her in the dark for so long? The next morning, Clara and Ethan found themselves in the kitchen, the silence between them thick with tension. Clara busied herself making coffee, avoiding Ethan's gaze. He stood by the counter, watching her, trying to find the right words to say. "Clara," he said finally, his voice soft, "I know this is overwhelming. It is for me too. But I think we need to find out the truth." Clara set the coffee pot down, with a little more force than necessary. "The truth," she echoed, her tone sharp. "What truth? That your father had an affair with my mother? That my entire life might be built on a lie?" Ethan flinched at her words, but he knew she had every right to be angry. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, "but I know we can't just ignore this. We owe it to ourselves to find out for sure." Clara turned to face him, her arms crossed over her chest. "And what if it's true, Ethan? What happens then?" "I don't know," Ethan said honestly, "but whatever happens, you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." Clara's expression softened, though her eyes were still clouded with doubt. She wanted to believe him, to trust that they could face this together. But the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future made it hard to feel anything but fear. Over the next few days, Clara and Ethan worked together to uncover the full story. They combed through old records, piecing together fragments of Margaret Lane's life. They found letters, photos, and even a journal that Margaret had kept during her time working for Ethan's family. The entries were revealing, filled with details about her struggles, her hopes, and her eventual decision to leave. One entry, in particular, stood out. In it, Margaret wrote about her love for a man she called R. She described their connection as passionate but forbidden, hinting at the pain and sacrifice it had caused her. Clara read the words with a mix of anger and sadness, feeling as though she were finally meeting a version of her mother she had never known. "I can't believe she went through all of this," Clara said one evening, her voice heavy with emotion. "She must have been so scared, so alone." Ethan sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "She was strong, Clara. She did what she thought was best for you." Clara nodded, though tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "I just wish you'd told me. Maybe things would have been different." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "We can't change the past, but we can decide what to do with it now." As they delved deeper into their shared history, Ethan and Clara began to learn more about each other as well. Ethan shared stories from his childhood, memories of a father who had been distant and a mother who had been strict and unyielding. Clara entered, her expression composed as always, though Ethan thought he detected a faint unease in her eyes. She had obviously been thinking about his request as much as he had. Ethan stood, gesturing for her to take a seat, but she remained by the door, her hands folded in front of her. "I've decided," she said, her voice steady but measured. "I'll help you." Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, though it was tinged with guilt. He knew he was asking a lot of her more than any employer should. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "I know this isn't easy for you." "No, it's not," Clara replied, her tone firm but not unkind. "But I understand why you're asking. Just let's keep this professional. No surprises, no last-minute changes." Ethan nodded. "Absolutely. Professional." There was an awkward pause, one that seemed to underline the fact that nothing about this situation was remotely professional. Clara cleared her throat. "So, what exactly do you need me to do?" Ethan moved to the small seating area in his office, motioning for Clara to join him. She hesitated before sitting on the edge of the sofa, her posture stiff. Ethan pulled out a folder from the coffee table, filled with notes and details about the dinner. "It's a private event, just a handful of people," he explained. "Mr. Donovan and his wife, a couple of other investors. They'll be expecting us to come as a couple, which means we need to look the part." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Look the part? You mean I need to pretend I'm used to dining with millionaires?" "Something like that," Ethan admitted. "You're smart, Clara. You can handle the conversations. It's the presentation we need to work on." "Presentation," she echoed, her tone skeptical. "You mean I need to look like I belong in your world?" Ethan winced. "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant," Clara said, though there was no malice in her voice. "And you're not wrong. If I'm going to pull this off, I can't go in looking like, well, myself." Ethan hesitated before nodding. "I've already arranged for a stylist to help. Someone discreet." "Of course you have," Clara muttered, though there was a faint hint of amusement in her tone. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. True to his word, Ethan had brought in a stylista woman named Vivian, who arrived with an air of authority and a wardrobe that could have outfitted royalty. Clara felt like a fish out of water as Vivian appraised her with a critical eye, muttering about silhouettes and color palettes. It was both mortifying and fascinating, being transformed piece by piece into someone she hardly recognized. By the time Vivian was done, Clara stood before the full-length mirror in Ethan's penthouse, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The tailored dress hugged her figure perfectly, the soft emerald fabric bringing out the green in her eyes. Her hair, usually pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, cascaded in soft waves over her shoulders. Even her makeup, subtle but expertly done, felt like a mask she wasn't entirely sure how to wear. "See? Perfection," Vivian declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "You'll turn heads, darling." Clara's cheeks flushed. She wasn't used to compliments, especially not ones delivered with such conviction. She glanced at Ethan, who had been watching from the other side of the room. For a moment, his usual composed expression faltered, replaced by something she couldn't quite place: surprise, perhaps, or admiration. "You look amazing," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Clara shifted uncomfortably. "This feels ridiculous," she said, smoothing the fabric of the dress. "I'm a maid, Ethan. This isn't me. It's just for one night," Ethan reminded her. "And you're not just a maid, Clara. You're—" He trailed off, as if realizing he was about to say too much. "You'll do great." Despite Ethan's reassurance, Clara couldn't shake her discomfort. The transformation was superficial, and she knew it. No matter how polished she looked, she was still the same person underneath, a woman who had spent her life working hard for every scrap of dignity and stability she had. Pretending to be someone else, even for a night, felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. Their rehearsals began shortly after. Ethan had mapped out their story meticulously, detailing how they had met, how long they had been married, even small anecdotes about their supposed life together. Clara found it both amusing and exhausting, trying to memorize the lies while maintaining the facade of a loving wife. "Why did you say we met at a bookstore?" Clara asked during one of their practice sessions. Ethan shrugged. "It seemed normal." "Normal," Clara repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Do you even go to bookstores?" "I do, actually," Ethan said defensively. Occasionally, Clara couldn't help but laugh, a sound that caught Ethan off guard. It was rare to hear her laugh, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. Ethan found himself smiling despite the absurdity of the situation. As the dinner drew closer, the rehearsals became less about the details and more about the dynamics. Ethan and Clara had to learn how to act like a couple, how to share looks of affection, how to navigate conversations as a team. It was awkward at first, with both of them tripping over their words and avoiding eye contact. But slowly, they began to find a rhythm, an unspoken understanding that made the charade almost believable. Almost. On the night of the dinner, Ethan waited in the living room, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He was nervous, though he would never admit it. The stakes were high, and failure wasn't an option. When Clara stepped out of her room, he turned, and for a moment, he forgot how to speak. She was stunning. The dress Vivian had chosen for her, a deep green gown, with an elegant neckline, fit her perfectly. Her hair and makeup, done with the same meticulous care, made her look every bit the part of a wealthy socialite. But it wasn't just her appearance that struck him. It was the way she carried herself, with a quiet confidence that Ethan hadn't seen before. "You look," Ethan began, but the words felt inadequate. "Incredible." Clara gave him a small smile, though her nerves were evident in the way she fidgeted with the hem of her dress. "Let's just get this over with," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety she felt. Ethan offered her his arm, a gesture that felt both foreign and intimate. "Ready?" "Not even a little," Clara admitted, but she took his arm anyway. As they stepped into the waiting car, both of them couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. For Ethan, it was the pressure to succeed, to maintain the image he had so carefully crafted. For Clara, it was a fear of being exposed, of stepping into a world where she didn't belong. Yet, as the car pulled away, a quiet understanding passed between Thima's shared determination to see this through, no matter what the night would bring. The car ride to the dinner venue was steeped in a tense silence. Ethan sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the passing city lights. Clara, seated beside him, smoothed her dress for the 100th time, trying to steady the butterflies that had taken up residence in her stomach. She thought it was better to leave, to build a life where you wouldn't be judged for where you came from. Clara's throat tightened. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't I know any of this? Because she was ashamed, her grandmother said sadly. Not of you, never of you, but of the choices she made. She wanted to shield you from the mistakes of the past. Clara sat back, absorbing her grandmother's words. She had spent so much of her life feeling like she didn't fully know her mother, and now, piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. It wasn't a perfect picture, but it was hers to understand. Meanwhile, Ethan faced a confrontation of his own. After his conversation with his father about Margaret and the DNA results, there was one person left to speak to: his mother. Eleanor Caldwell was a woman of unshakable composure, but Ethan knew that beneath her polished exterior lay years of bottled emotions and unspoken truths. He invited her to the penthouse for dinner, a rare gesture that surprised her, but one she accepted nonetheless. When she arrived, she took in the apartment with her usual air of detached interest, but Ethan noticed her lingering gaze on the photo of his family in the study, the very photo that had set everything in motion. "Why did you invite me here, Ethan?" Eleanor asked as they sat down at the dining table. "You've never been one for sentimental dinners." Ethan hesitated, pouring them both a glass of wine before speaking. "I wanted to talk about Margaret, about what happened back then." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her grip on the stem of her glass tightened. "I thought we already covered this." "Not entirely," Ethan said, leaning forward. "You told me she left because of a scandal, because of Dad. But what about you? What was your role in all of it?" For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then she sighed, setting her glass down with a quiet clink. "I wasn't kind to her," she admitted. "When I found out about the affair, I was angry, furious. At your father, at her, at everyone. I said things I shouldn't have. I made it clear she wasn't welcome in our lives anymore." Ethan frowned, his chest tightening with frustration. "You forced her to leave?" "She made the decision herself," Eleanor said defensively. "But yes, I made it difficult for her to stay. I thought I was protecting our family. But looking back, I see now that I was wrong. I should have handled it differently." The admission surprised Ethan. His mother was not one to admit fault, and hearing her acknowledge her mistakes felt like a small but significant step forward. "It wasn't just about protecting the family," Ethan said quietly. "It was about control, about keeping up appearances." Eleanor's lips tightened, but she didn't deny it. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but it's too late to change the past." "It's not too late to do better," Ethan said firmly. "You can't erase what happened, but you can take responsibility for it. For Margaret. For Clara." "Clara?" Eleanor repeated, her brow furrowing. "What does she have to do with this?" "She's Margaret's daughter," Ethan said. "She's been working for me for years, and she deserves better than the life our family left her with." Eleanor's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt passing over her face. "What do you want me to do?" "Start by acknowledging her," Ethan said. "Not as a maid, not as a mistake, but as a person who's been affected by our actions. She deserves that much." Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "Perhaps you're right," she said. "Perhaps it's time to face the consequences of the choices we made." The reconciliation between Clara and Eleanor was tentative but necessary. At Ethan's insistence, Eleanor invited Clara to lunch at a quiet cafe, hoping to start mending the rift that had existed long before either of them had met. Clara was hesitant at first, unsure of Eleanor's intentions, but Ethan encouraged her to go. When Clara arrived, she found Eleanor already seated, her usual air of poise softened by an uncharacteristic nervousness. Eleanor stood as Clara approached, offering a polite but genuine smile. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said, gesturing to the seat across from her. Clara sat down, her posture cautious. "I wasn't sure if I should." "I don't blame you," Eleanor admitted. "I haven't given you much reason to trust me." The conversation was slow at first, both women circling each other with careful words and guarded expressions. But as the meal progressed, Eleanor began to open up, sharing her regrets and acknowledging the ways her actions had hurt Clara's mother and, by extension, Clara herself. "I can't undo what's been done," Eleanor said quietly, "but I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Clara studied her, searching for sincerity in her words. What she found surprised her a vulnerability that Eleanor rarely showed, a crack in the armor of a woman who had spent her life projecting strength. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. "I appreciate that," Clara said finally. "I don't know if I can forgive everything, but I'm willing to try." Eleanor nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "That's all I can ask." The dinner that had started it all felt like a distant memory as Ethan and Clara reflected on how far they had come. Their relationship, once defined by power dynamics and unspoken barriers, had transformed into something deeper, a bond forged through shared struggles and mutual growth. Ethan had learned to let go of the need to control every aspect of his life, embracing the imperfections and complexities that made him human. Clara, in turn, had found her voice, stepping out of the shadow of her mother's past and into a future she was building for herself. One evening, as they sat together in the penthouse, Ethan raised his glass to Clara. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice warm with gratitude. Clara smiled, clinking her glass against his. "To family, however unexpected it might be." And in that moment, they both knew that while their journey had been messy, complicated, and at times painful, it had led them to a place of understanding, acceptance, and hopefully a place where they could finally move forward together. The days turned into weeks, and the heavy tension that once lingered in the air began to dissipate. Clara and Ethan had spent countless hours untangling the complicated web of their pasts, confronting painful truths, and navigating the unpredictable journey of forgiveness and self-discovery. Now, as the dust settled, their lives began to take on new shapes they had never imagined for themselves. For Clara, the transformation was deeply personal. She had always thought of herself as someone destined to live in the background, someone who worked hard and quietly, with little expectation of recognition or reward. But everything that had happened learning about her mother's hidden past, reconciling with the Caldwell family, and finding her own voice had changed that perspective. She had moved out of the servants' quarters in Ethan's penthouse and into her own small apartment. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was hers a space that felt like the first step toward independence. She had also enrolled in more college courses, this time focusing on nonprofit management. Inspired by her mother's sacrifices and her own struggles, Clara dreamed of starting an organization to help women like Margaret women who had been silenced or overlooked by society, but carried untold strength within them. One afternoon, Clara sat at her kitchen table, reviewing grant applications for her first project. The nonprofit wasn't fully operational yet, but she had already begun to build a network of supporters. Ethan, true to his word, had offered his financial backing, though Clara made it clear she wanted to run the organization on her terms. Their partnership had evolved into one of mutual respect, each of them pushing the other to be better. As she worked, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Ethan. "Are you free for dinner tonight? I have a surprise." Clara smiled. Their friendship, once defined by formalities and unspoken boundaries, had grown into something genuine and unpretentious. She replied, "What's the occasion?" His response came quickly. "You'll see." Ethan had also undergone a significant transformation. The ambitious, tightly wound businessman had begun to loosen his grip on the rigid expectations he had placed on himself. The revelations about his family had forced him to confront not only his past, but also his present, the kind of man he wanted to be and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. He had restructured his company, delegating more responsibilities to his team and focusing on projects that aligned with his newfound priorities. One of those projects was a community outreach program designed to provide job training and support for underprivileged workers. It was an idea inspired by Clara's story, though Ethan had made sure to credit her in every meeting and proposal. That evening, as Clara arrived at Ethan's penthouse for dinner, she was struck by how different it felt. The space, once cold and imposing, now radiated a sense of warmth. Fresh flowers adorned the dining table, and the faint sound of jazz played in the background. Ethan greeted her with a smile, dressed casually for once in a button-down shirt and jeans. "You've outdone yourself," Clara said, taking in the setup. "I wanted to make it special," Ethan said, leading her to the table. "It's not every day we get to celebrate." "Celebrate what?" Clara asked, her curiosity piqued. Ethan poured them each a glass of wine before answering. You, he said simply. And everything you've accomplished. Clara's cheeks flushed. Ethan, I haven't done anything yet. The nonprofit is still in its early stages. And yet, you've already helped so many people, Ethan said. You've inspired me, Clara. You've inspired everyone around you. Tonight is about recognizing that. Clara was touched, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. I don't know what to say. Just say you'll keep going, Ethan said, raising his glass. Because the world needs more people like you. They clinked glasses, the moment one of quiet gratitude and mutual respect. As they ate, their conversation drifted from the past to the future, each of them sharing their hopes and dreams. For the first time, they felt like equals, not bound by the roles they had once played, but connected by the experiences they had shared. As the months passed, both Clara and Ethan continued to carve out their new paths. Clara's nonprofit officially launched with a small but impactful program, providing housing and career training for women in need. The launch event, held in a modest community center, was attended by dozens of supporters, including Ethan, Eleanor, and even Penelope Donovan, who had become an unexpected ally after the fateful dinner. Eleanor's relationship with Clara remained complicated but improved. The once icy matriarch had softened, taking an active interest in Clara's work and even offering to help connect her with influential donors. It wasn't an easy road. There were still moments of tension and misunderstanding, but both women were committed to building a relationship grounded in honesty and mutual respect. Ethan, meanwhile, found himself drawn to the simplicity and authenticity of his new life. He had stepped back from the constant grind of business, taking more time to travel, volunteer, and connect with the people around him. His relationship with his parents, particularly his father, remained strained, but he had made peace with the fact that not every wound could be fully healed. One evening, as Ethan walked through the city, he found himself outside the community center where Clara's program was based. The lights were on, and through the window, he could see Clara talking to a group of women, her expression animated and her gestures passionate. She was in her element, her purpose shining through in every word and movement. Ethan smiled, a quiet sense of pride filling his chest. He didn't interrupt. This was her moment, and he was content to watch from the sidelines. For all the twists and turns their lives had taken, he was grateful for the path that had brought them here. Years later, Clara and Ethan stood together at the grand opening of a new facility for Clara's nonprofit state of the Arts Center, offering education, childcare, and job training. The building was a culmination of years of hard work, a testament to Clara's vision and determination. As Clara addressed the crowd, her voice steady and confident, she spoke not only of the program's mission, but also of the journey that had led her there. She spoke of her mother, of the sacrifices and struggles that had shaped her, and of the unexpected allies who had helped her along the way. None of this would have been possible without the people who believed in me, Clara said, her gaze briefly meeting Ethan's in the audience. They reminded me that no matter where you come from, you have the power to create something meaningful. And for that, I am forever grateful. The applause was thunderous, the energy in the room electric. As Clara stepped down from the stage, Ethan was the first to greet her, his smile wide and genuine. You were amazing, he said, pulling her into a hug. Clara laughed, her eyes glistening with happy tears. I couldn't have done it without you. Don't sell yourself short, Ethan said. This is all you, Clara. As they stood together, surrounded by friends, family, and supporters, they felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Their journey had been messy and imperfect, filled with moments of pain and uncertainty. But it had also been transformative, pushing them to grow in ways they never thought possible. For Clara, it was a story of resiliency, finding her voice, and reclaiming her identity. For Ethan, it was a story of redemption off learning to embrace vulnerability and prioritize what truly mattered. And for both of them, it was a story of connection, of two lives intertwined in unexpected and extraordinary ways. In the end, They were no longer defined by the roles they had once played: maid and employer, strangers bound by circumstance. They were partners, friends, and family in every way that mattered. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that their best chapters were still ahead of them.